Today is about fundamental questions. How does our thinking work? How do we make decisions? Where does our own mind lead us astray? Daniel Kahneman has written an exciting book about those topics, Thinking Fast and Slow. And today we're going to take a look at it. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today I'd like to present to you Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman is a psychologist and economist, and he received the Nobel Prize in economics. Most of the work that ultimately led to this prize has been done in collaboration with another scientist, Amos Tversky, who unfortunately died in 1996. This book is a collection and a summary of the joint work between Kahneman and Tversky. At least that's how I understand it. The book is divided into 5 parts and we will take a look at them. In the first part, an important distinction is introduced between System 1 and System 2. System 2 does the slow thinking. System 2 is what we experience as our thinking conscious self. System 2 is what we use if we consciously focus our attention on a topic, if we consciously think about a difficult problem. And System 2 is able to solve difficult problems. But this is difficult and tiresome and exhausting. And System 2 is rather lazy. We wouldn't even have the capacity to permanently use System 2 and to apply it to every tiny problem. For that, we have System 1. System 1 does the fast thinking. System 1 is active permanently. It works unconsciously, unknown, we don't even know it is there. But it has a lot of influence on our thoughts and on our decisions. But System 1 is prone to error because System 1 is so fast, because it relies on simple heuristics, on rules of thumb. Let me give you an example. In a study about public perception of risk, participants are shown pairs of risks, such as accidents and diabetes. And they are asked which of those has a higher probability, which of those causes more deaths. What do you think? Accidents or diabetes? Diabetes actually kills 4 times as many people as accidents do. However, most participants believe accidents are more common. And there is a simple reason for that. We don't have any idea which is more likely, which kills how many people. However, what System 1 does in such a situation is it substitutes a simpler, easier, similar question for the difficult one. In this case, System 1 checks for which one do examples easier come to mind, for which can I recall more examples. And we all can probably come up with lots of examples for accidents because they frequently appear in the media, things like plane crashes, train wrecks, whatnot. But we probably don't have a lot of examples for people dying from diabetes. So System 1 says, oh well, this is probably more likely because I know more examples. Such heuristics often work, but often they also lead to wrong conclusions, as in this case. And there are plenty of ways where System 1 can lead us astray, where System 1 generates biases and fallacies. The ways System 1 works and the problems it creates are a major topic of the book. An important hint at this point. System 1 and System 2 are merely metaphors. We don't really have these 2 lines of thinking, and there are certainly no parts in our brain that correspond to System 1 and System 2. If Kahneman says System 1 does something, he basically means it happens automatically. They are merely metaphors to make the topics easier to comprehend. In part 1, Kahneman also introduces an important acronym that is a recurring theme throughout the book. Visiati. What you see is all there is, because this is another basic aspect of how System 1 works. It only considers information that is known, it only thinks about things that are right in front of us. It never considers that there might be important information, important aspects that are unknown to us. A simple example. Is Mindik a good leader? She is strong, intelligent. Now we usually say, oh yes, that's a good fit, even though it could go on with cruel, corrupt. What we don't ask ourselves in such a situation is, what information do I require to decide whether Mindik is a good leader? Which additional things do I need to know? This would be an operation of System 2, but as you know, System 2 is rather lazy. The second part of the book deals with heuristics and biases. Here the ways System 1 works is further examined and several specific examples of biases are given. There will be individual videos about many of them, so I will only give 2 brief examples here. The first concerns an experiment with a woman called Linda, an imaginary woman. Linda is 31 years old, she's single, outspoken, she cares about matters like discrimination or social justice, and she participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Participants in the experiment are given this short description of Linda. It's actually a bit longer, I summarized it a bit. And they are given a list of 8 statements, such as she works in a bookshop and takes yoga classes, or she is an insurance agent. And participants are asked to judge how likely it is that those statements really apply to Linda, how likely it is that they are true. Among those statements is one that says, she is a bank teller. And a little more down the list is another one that says, she is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. Now obviously, being a bank teller who's also a feminist, this is included in the total group of bank tellers. Every feminist bank teller is also a bank teller, but not the other way around. So clearly, being a bank teller is more likely than being a bank teller with an additional requirement. However, most participants in that experiment rated bank teller and active in the feminist movement as more likely, because that gave them a story, a narrative that made sense in itself. It gave them a sense of likeness. So you see, System 1 is clearly not a good statistician. And this also shows in another example. Kahneman held a lecture or something like that in the Israeli Air Force about how good education works. And he explained that praise and positive reinforcement is better than criticism. And the flight instructor disagreed. He said, you know, if someone is doing really well and I praise him, he will do worse the next day. However, if someone is doing really badly and I yell at them, they will do better the next day. So actually criticism works well, praise does not. And the observations of this flight instructor are entirely correct. But the reason is quite different from what he thought. What he observed was a statistical phenomenon known as regression to the mean. It's quite simple. If you are a fighter pilot, you have a certain skill level, a certain baseline. However, on a specific day, in a specific flight, your performance doesn't exactly equal this basic skill, because sometimes you have a good day and you perform better than usual, and sometimes you have a really bad day and you perform worse than usual. However, your performance is always related to this baseline. Now, obviously, if you have a great day and your performance is way above your usual level, it's most likely that the next day will be worse because you will again be closer to your standard level. And just the other way around, if you have a really bad day and your performance sucks, it is likely to get better the next day. So it has nothing to do with praise and criticism, but is merely a statistical phenomenon. The third part of the book is called Overconfidence, because we have a lot of confidence in our minds, in our judgment, in our decisions. However, this trust is often not justified. One aspect that I found rather interesting and funny in this part is that algorithms, simple algorithms, often make better predictions than human experts. As an example, one Orly Eschenfelder, who is an economist and who likes to drink fine wines, created a simple formula to create the future price development of fine Bordeaux wines in the year they are produced. Even if you are not a wine drinker, you probably know that prices for wine vary a lot, and even if they come from the same producer, there are some years that are especially good and prices rise steeply, and there are years that are not as good, where prices don't rise as much. And of course, if you want to buy wine to keep it for later, you want those that get a higher price and increase a lot in quality. And Eschenfelder's formula used just 3 simple measures: the average temperature in summer, amount of rain at harvest time, and amount of rain during the previous winter. And his formula is more than 90% precise, so his predictions are very close to the actual price development. So what do you think how the experts reacted to that formula, and also the wine lovers? Now, the experts obviously didn't like it because it questioned their expertise to have an algorithm do better, but wine lovers could clearly have benefited from that formula. But even they found it strange and even grotesque. They said, this is weird to judge wine without even tasting it, and they didn't want it to have anything to do with it. We trust in our own judgment, even if we have evidence to the contrary. And the best example for this is another story from Kahneman's past. At one point, he and some colleagues proposed to the Israeli Ministry of Education a curriculum about judgment and decision-making for high school. And the ministry was interested, and the group started working. They met once a week, and after a year they had made some progress, and they decided to make an estimation of how long this project would take to finish. They wrote their estimations on pieces of paper, collected them. They ended up with 2 years plus minus half a year. However, in that group was one person who was an expert on the subject, because he dealt with such projects regularly and had known lots of teams who had undertaken similar projects. So Kahneman asked him, "You know a lot of similar teams. How long do they usually take for such a project?" And that guy was confused at first, and he said, "Oh, now that you mention it, a lot of teams never finish successfully. About 40% of teams fail. And of those who finish, None that I know took less than 7 years or more than 10. And this was a bit disappointing, obviously. Kahneman then further asked, and if you consider manpower, qualification, and so on, how do we fare in comparison to the other teams? And the guy said, below average, but not much. Well, at this point, it would have probably been a good idea to stop the project. However, this group took the obvious path. They stopped making estimations. Kahneman left the group at some point when he moved away from Israel. However, he later heard that the curriculum had been finished 8 years afterwards. And at this point, no one in the Ministry of Education cared for it anymore, and it was never actually used. Part 4 introduces another distinction between econs, who are rational agents, and average humans, who are not so rational. The econ is the model that economics believe in and that economic theories are based on. An econ makes rational decisions, he has fixed preferences, and he tries to increase his own benefit. However, as Kahneman shows, humans don't work like that. A simple example. Would you like to make a bet? I flip a coin, you pick heads or tails. If you win, you get 150 bucks. If you lose 100 bucks. This is clearly a favorable bet. The expected value, the average of all the different outcomes, is 25 bucks. So an econ would always accept this bet, but you probably hesitated. And this is because for normal humans, losses are more painful than gains are pleasurable. Losing 100 bucks is way more painful than gaining 100 bucks is pleasurable. And losing 100 might even be worse in relation than gaining 150. We have a strong loss aversion that leads us to make decisions that are not rational, that no econ would make. Another example. The way we judge probabilities also differs from the way econs would do it. Let's say the probability of a certain event is increased by 5%. An econ wouldn't care if this is from 0% to 5, from 60 to 65, or from 95 to 100%, because it's a plus of 5% either way. It doesn't actually make a difference. It does for us though. At the lower end of the scale, it makes a great difference for us if something is entirely impossible or if there is just a slight chance. If there is just a tiny chance, either we ignore it entirely or we overestimate that chance. And this is the reason so many people buy lottery tickets, because they pay for the win being theoretically possible, even though it is highly unlikely. And on the other end of the scale, we underestimate high probabilities. If someone tells me, oh, there is a 99% chance your house won't burn down, I will say, oh, but it still could happen, couldn't it? Maybe I better buy a fire insurance, and that's what the whole insurance industry is based on. Chapter 5 further pursues the topic of humans not being rational agents and making decisions that are not rational. And here a further third distinction is introduced between the experiencing self and the remembering self. This has nothing to do with system 1 and 2, it's something different entirely. Your experiencing self is the one that watches this video right now and enjoys it or is bored by it, I hope the former, and your remembering self is the one that will later look back on this video and say, oh, this was a nice video altogether, or oh, this was a waste of time. Now you might say, oh, so what's the point? It doesn't make a big difference, does it? It actually does, because our experiencing and remembering self judge events quite differently. Let me give you an example you can probably relate to. I use an example that is different than in the book. You might have seen the series Game of Thrones. After the famous series A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, quite a popular series. However, it is infamous for having a weak and disappointing ending. And a lot of fans probably said after watching that ending, this ending ruined the entire series for me. And even if you haven't watched it, if you don't know it, you can probably relate to that. You probably had experiences like that where something ended really badly and that ruined the entire experience. But if we think about it, is this really how it works? All of those fans of Game of Thrones, they watched the series for 7 seasons. They enjoyed. They watched dozens of episodes and they enjoyed it, and it was pleasurable, and they liked them, and they spent a lot of time enjoying and liking them. And this cannot be undone because it's already in the past. It has already happened. So all that the bad ending can ruin is our memory of the series. And this is because our remembering self doesn't care for all that time we spent enjoying the series. Our remembering self focuses on 2 things, on the peak and on the end. And therefore, a bad ending can ruin the memory of an entire event. And this isn't merely a fun fact. Our remembering self is quite powerful. It is the one that determines our decisions. And the most striking example for that is the cold hand experiment that Kahneman and colleagues did. In this experiment, the participants were asked to put their hand into a bowl of cold water, really cold water, so it was quite an unpleasant experience. After 60 seconds, the scientist told them, all right, you can now take your hand out, and they got a warm towel. And there was another session. And it started the same way. Hand into the bowl of cold water, 60 highly unpleasant seconds. After those 60 seconds, the scientist opened a small valve that allowed warmer water to flow into this bowl. The average temperature increased just a bit. It was still unpleasant, but not as unpleasant as before. And this went on for another 30 seconds, and then again participants were allowed to take out their hands and they got the warm towel. So, both sessions started with 60 highly unpleasant seconds. And the longer one added another 30 rather unpleasant seconds. Now, after those 2 sessions, participants were told that there would be a third one and that one of the previous sessions would be repeated, and they were allowed to choose which one. And the great majority of participants chose to repeat the longer episode because the remembering self had retained a less unpleasant memory of that one. But as you recall, the longer episode included the entire shorter one, plus 30 seconds in addition that were unpleasant as well. So this clearly is a decision that doesn't make any sense, that clearly is not rational. At the end of the book, there is a short conclusion chapter where Kahneman summarizes the major aspects from the book in reverse order. So he starts with the experiencing and remembering self. Here he points out that this matter raises the question, which should get preference? Because this has quite practical applications. Think of medicine, for example. A patient has to undergo a highly unpleasant treatment. Should the doctor try to make it as quick as possible so the experiencing self doesn't have to suffer as much? Or should the doctor focus on lowering the peaks and making the ending more pleasant so that the remembering self can maintain a less unpleasant memory, even if it means that it takes longer? In regard to econs and humans, Kahneman points out the political relevance. For example, the so-called Chicago School of Economics believes in the econ. So it says the state should take a step back and let people do as they please, because people don't make wrong decisions, and if they do, it is certainly their own fault. Freedom is basically free. However, behavioral economists who believe in the actual humans like Kahneman does, believe that freedom isn't free. And if you let just people do as they please, they will make decisions that are not beneficial to themselves, and to some degree you might have to protect people from themselves. In this regard, Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein promises to be quite an interesting book, and we will certainly have a look at it in the future on this channel. In regard to System 1 and System 2, Kahneman points out that we will always make those mistakes. Even he still does, despite all he knows about them. Knowing how those biases and fallacies work does not mean that they won't occur anymore for us. All we can do is approach critical situations carefully, where we have to make important decisions, and consciously check for biases and fallacies that might occur and try to work against them. This is, of course, not easy, and we have to do it consciously each time. Kahneman points out that it is often easier for observers to notice biases and fallacies than for those who are acting and are deeply involved. And that's why he wrote a book that is for everybody, rather than a book that is especially for experts, for those who are decision makers. Kahneman says if there is more general knowledge about how things work, then gossip at the water cooler, better gossip at the water cooler, might ultimately lead to better decisions. And for that, we also need a vocabulary to talk about those things, and Kahneman provides that. At the end of each chapter in the book, there is a short section speaking about whatever the topic was, and there are a couple of imaginary quotes that deal with those topics, so we get an impression of how it would look like or sound like to discuss those topics. At the very end of the book, there are two interesting appendices, because two articles by Kahneman and Tversky are included here. In those articles, you won't find a lot of new information, because the topics have already been discussed in the book. However, it is a glimpse of the past and of the work of Kahneman and Tversky, so I appreciate that they are included. I think this is quite an exciting book, and I believe it is also an important book. Certainly in the area of soft skills, but also as an important piece of general knowledge, because it gives us a basic understanding of how our mind works, and it teaches us the important lesson that we can't always trust it entirely. It is quite an extensive book. In this video, I could only give you a tiny slice of the information and topics and biases and whatnot that are included in this book. So if you actually read it, you will find a lot of additional materials. If you read the book and you find it difficult at first, don't worry, it will get easier after part 1. In part 1, a lot of basics have to be explained, and you might get a bit overwhelmed. That's what happened for me. But starting with with part 2, things became much easier for me. I could clearly identify the topic each chapter is about. I knew how it fit into the general picture, and it all became much easier to understand. Overall, I found this book easier to understand than The Black Swan because it is a bit more structured, a bit more to the point, and it was overall quite an enjoyable read. What I like about the book as well is that it has tiny autobiographical sections here and there where we get to know a bit about the joint work of Kahneman and Tversky. And I think the book is to some degree also meant as an appreciation of a dear friend and colleague, and I like that. In theory, likes and subscribers should only depend on how much people enjoy a video. However, experience teaches us that if you specifically ask for likes and subscription in a video, there will be more of it. So I would be quite happy. We will see each other again next week in the channel update December, the last channel update of 2021. For today I take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.